Hey everyone! Today's story is about a man who gets ISEKAI'D to another world to defeat the Demon King. After countless battles and trials, he finally succeeds and steps into the magic circle to return home. But something goes terribly wrong. So with that said, let's begin the story. The guard respectfully addressed the king, reporting that the hero had left the capital and entered a special territory. This place turned out to be an underground dungeon, commonly referred to by the people as the ruins of the beginning. Lord Favner bowed his head in deep thought, pondering the significance of this event. Sitting on his throne, the king suddenly exclaimed loudly that the long-awaited day had finally come. His voice was filled with genuine joy that the hero was finally coming to him. Unexpectedly, for those present, the Lord activated a special magic. He created a transparent screen right in the air, showing his master the exact location of the young man. The ruler was eager to see the true appearance of the hero he had heard so much about. At that moment, the dark-haired young man was bravely fighting magical creatures with his sword and shield. He looked quite skilled and brave, as he attacked his enemies first, without waiting for them to attack. However, looking at his opponent through a magic spell, the king was extremely dissatisfied with what he saw. He began to comment indignantly, noting that it was not necessary to strike from top to bottom, because it was much more effective to keep the attack horizontal, inflicting wider and more dangerous wounds. Lord Favner did not understand his master's reaction at all and wondered why he wished his enemy luck in battle instead of rejoicing at his possible death. The ruler continued to loudly complain about the hero's fighting technique. He noted that it was simply frightening to watch, so clumsy and unprofessional were his movements. Favner gently asked him to show a little calm in such a tense moment. But in response, the king only continued to rage with renewed vigor. He asked to look at this clumsy guy, who, in his first run through the dungeon, was completely unable to distribute his own strength correctly, wasting it. By that point, the guard, unable to withstand the tension, simply sat down on the floor and covered his head with his hands, clearly understanding that the Demon King was furious about what was happening on the screen. Maintaining his outward calm, Favner reasonably explained that if his lord continued to rage in this form, the castle servants would become concerned and might raise unnecessary alarm. The lord said bitterly that if the hero died now, all his 10 years of work would be wasted, and that was unacceptable. All his 10 years of work would be wasted, and that was unacceptable. Not understanding what exactly was being discussed, Favner reminded him that the ruler himself had repeatedly personally inspected the dungeon of the first assignment and had to be sure of its safety. In addition, Favner dared to remind his lord that he himself had created this hero, and now he was scolding him for his incorrect fighting technique, as if he had forgotten about his creation. And yet the Demon King continued to insist that his opponent was too cowardly and indecisive for a true hero. Then Favner made a compelling argument. The hero had been summoned to Yggdrasia, and less than half a month later, he had already been sent to a dangerous dungeon. He simply hadn't had time to gain experience. Accepting the inevitability of what was to come, the Lord sighed heavily. He noted that he considered it dangerous to simply observe without the right to intervene when someone's life was at stake. He involuntarily recalled that familiar feeling from his own past, when losing a battle meant certain death. Watching the battle with the monsters through the magic window, the Lord thoughtfully remarked that the king could be the strongest being on the entire continent if it weren't for the hero who was taking away his strength and attention. Looking at his master, he felt warm and pleasant emotions of sincere affection, despite the complexity of their relationship. And yet the ruler continued to stare intently at the dark-haired fighter, who at that moment was desperately fleeing from the raging fire in the narrow corridor. Shouting loudly in indignation, he jumped up from his throne and asked menacingly who had conducted the final test of the fire trap in action, allowing such a dangerous malfunction. Stunned by this question, Favner replied confusedly that this mission had previously been entrusted to Loki, one of the 4 generals. The Lord of Demons was so dissatisfied with his servant's work that he immediately wanted to find him and severely punish him for such poor performance of an important task. By that time, the main character had miraculously managed to reach the massive doors leading to the depths of the dungeon. He pushed the door open with his hand. He found himself face to face with a huge stone golem. The dark-haired young man instantly realized that he was facing the master of the dungeon, who was a serious and dangerous opponent. However, the upcoming battle with a stronger opponent allowed the hero to finally test his new magical skill and practice in real combat. Activating the dragon's heart, he rushed into battle without hesitation, and he was surprised to discover that he could now inflict enormous damage without much effort, something that had previously been beyond his reach. His skill had grown stronger, and he was ready to launch a new attack. But at that solemn moment, the mysterious demon king appeared out of nowhere right in front of him and destroyed the golem. The main character looked around in confusion, not understanding what was happening, because these ruins were his personal trial, which no one could visit without his consent and knowledge. The Lord said with contempt in his voice that the young man had no right to call himself a real man because of the pathetic and clumsy strength he had just demonstrated. Stammering slightly from surprise and excitement, the young man was forced to admit that he himself was well aware of his own vulnerability and lack of experience at that moment. Then the ruler imperiously declared that the young man had been chosen as a hero by the people, and now he was obliged to move forward no matter what, regardless of his fears and doubts. Changing his tone abruptly, he asked what the dark-haired young man's real name was. The hero straightened up and squared his shoulders, and with dignity, he replied that his name was Hyun Karudo. Pointing his finger at Karudo, the Demon King gave him some stern advice. Become so strong that in the future, under no circumstances will you disgrace your own name. With these words, he disappeared without a trace, leaving the hero completely alone. Left alone, the main character could not understand who this stranger was who had suddenly appeared and just as suddenly disappeared. And yet Karudo made a firm promise to himself to become so strong that in the future he would be able to fight back and not lose to the mysterious man in the mask if they ever met again. Returning to his castle, the king suddenly fell to his knees in the middle of the throne room and began to bitterly reproach himself for such a rash and impulsive act. He clearly understood that, without thinking, he had saved the hero by interfering in his destiny. Extremely concerned, Fafnir hurried to ask what exactly was happening to his master at that moment. After all, this had never happened before. Slowly raising his head, the ruler announced with pain in his voice that, of all the possible outcomes, the object of his admiration, the very same black swordsman, turned out to be himself, but from the distant past. He considered such an ironic turn of events too cruel and unfair to himself. At that moment, Fafnir cautiously noted that the hero had returned safely from the dungeon and was now safe, and that was the main thing. Unable to hold back the tears that had welled up, the Demon King reflected on how everything had turned into a series of misfortunes and emotional turmoil that he had not expected at all. Using special skills during a decisive magical attack, the main character summoned a divine power capable of bringing down all of heaven's punishment upon the heads of evil. Following this, he activated the hellish fire dragon, and a devastating divine light strike, unleashing the full power of his abilities upon the enemy. After passing through countless hordes of monsters, Karudo finally reached the Demon King himself. He dealt devastating damage to his main enemy. Karudo was puzzled to see that, instead of fear or pain, the Demon King only smiled mysteriously in response. A few days later, in the royal capital of Midgard, the ruler solemnly expressed her deep gratitude to Karudo before the entire court. Moreover, she sincerely noted that the young man had accomplished a great feat, and all the inhabitants of the kingdom were genuinely happy about his safe return from a dangerous journey. And yet, the princess did not quite understand why Karudo so insistently wanted to return to his world, leaving behind everyone who had become dear to him. Not getting a clear answer to her question, she sadly explained that the hero should at least say goodbye to his companions, who had been with him for so long. Scratching the back of his head in his characteristic gesture, Karudo casually noted that his friends would unconditionally accept any decision he made, whatever it might be. In addition, he added rather sharply that he did not like long, drawn-out farewells, preferring quick and decisive partings. Looking at the girl, the main character expressed his opinion. In his opinion, it was rather strange when a hero, after defeating the Demon King, continued to sit aimlessly in one place instead of moving on. Not wanting to listen to such reasoning any longer, the princess abruptly rose from her throne and exclaimed excitedly that she completely disagreed with this approach to parting. And yet, deep down, she understood that in reality, partings can never be easy, no matter how much we want them to be. Then, in the name of the storm, the god born from the earth itself, the ruler solemnly opened the gates of the twilight otherworld, leading back to the hero's reality. Feeling salty tears on her cheeks, she realized that forcing Karudo to say goodbye to his comrades against his will would be an extremely foolish and cruel thing to do. However, the princess continued to sincerely believe that they would definitely meet again someday, even if they were parting forever now. Looking at the dazzling divine light opening the portal, the main character couldn't believe his eyes that he was really returning home after all his trials. He was lost in memories of how exactly 1 year ago, on this very day, he had just returned home with a new game and was immediately unexpectedly summoned to another world, without even having time to realize what was happening. In addition, He clearly remembered that he was ordered to eliminate the Demon King, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. A year ago, Kuruto could not have imagined how it would all end and whether he would survive it all. Moreover, he suddenly realized something amazing. Even such an ordinary and worthless high school student, as he had always considered himself, was still able to overcome incredible difficulties and emerge victorious from the battle with the greatest evil. Covering his eyes in anticipation of the transition, he thought about how it was all really over and he could finally breathe a sigh of relief. However, unexpectedly, instead of relief, he felt intense anxiety and a chilling fear that gripped his heart. The main character realized with horror that a whole year had passed since he was summoned to another world, and he had no idea what had been happening to him in the real world all this time. Was anyone waiting for him there? Finding himself in the real world, the main character was greatly surprised by what he saw before his eyes. Deep snowdrifts stretched out around him, and the air temperature was unusually low, chilling him to the bone. However, looking up at the sky, Kuruto inadvertently noticed the majestic dragons flying silently overhead, and he realized with horror that he was still in Yggdrasia and had not returned home at all. Suddenly, his confused words were heard by a fair-haired stranger who rushed up to the uninvited stranger. Without wanting to find out what had happened or understand the circumstances, she immediately began to inflict significant physical damage on Kuruto, attacking him without warning. Kuruto deftly dodged the barrage of blows. He tried to appeal to her common sense and said that there was absolutely no need to settle scores after the death of the Demon King. These rash words proved fatal. The blonde stopped abruptly and indignantly remarked that her opponent was talking complete nonsense that had nothing to do with reality. During the intense fight, the young man tried to explain himself. He explained that the Demon King had been defeated by a hero just a few days ago. In response, the girl said with bewilderment that there had been no Demon King in Nibelheim for several hundred years, and what he was saying was simply impossible. Surprised by this statement, the main character thought that this simply could not be true, because he had fought him with his own hands. Suddenly, he felt several painful abrasions on his face. Despite the situation, he asked if the girl herself had been injured in the battle. Smirking, the warrior arrogantly remarked that she did not wish to be humiliated by some pathetic human showing concern for her. In addition, she solemnly introduced herself as the daughter of the village elder of Fuser from the demon race. Brunhild challenges him to a formal duel. Frightened by such a serious turn of events, Kuruto hastily asked her to stop and end the conversation peacefully, without a bloody duel. At that very moment, a huge brown bear appeared out of nowhere and suddenly attacked Brunhild from behind. Without a moment's hesitation, the main character rushed towards the girl and quickly activated a powerful spell. Defeating the dangerous enemy with a single precise blow, Kuruto managed to save Brunhild from certain death. The girl, finding herself in the young man's reliable hands, shyly asked him to let her go. However, she could not understand who this mysterious stranger really was and why he had so easily and simply dealt with a dangerous enemy that was beyond her capabilities. Still, unable to cope with the extremely low temperatures any longer, the main character began to cough and shiver violently. He quietly said, gasping for breath, that he urgently needed to get warm, otherwise he would die. After these words, Kuruto suddenly lost consciousness and fell heavily to the cold ground. Deeply concerned, Brunhild ran up to her friend, shaking him by the shoulders and anxiously shouting questions about what was happening and why he was feeling so bad. A few hours later, the main character finally woke up after a bad dream, feeling extremely weak all over. Sincerely happy that the young man had awakened, Brunhild breathed a sigh of relief and noted that he had become completely stiff from the cold and had nearly died of hypothermia. Noticing the appetizingly roasted meat standing nearby, Kuruto inquired what the dish was and where it had come from. Brunhild asked her friend not to think about it for now and just eat. She also explained that it was her way of thanking him for bravely defeating a bear named Frostmasker, which had nearly killed her. The main character racked his brain, recalling the details of that recent battle, and asked again if his friend was injured. After all, he was worried about her condition. The girl replied reassuringly that now, thanks to his help, everything was fine. And yet she explained the amazing feature of her kind. Her family heals wounds by eating the cells of the defeated enemy. In addition, it turned out that this unusual method is suitable not only for regenerating damaged tissues, but also for gaining the strength and abilities of the enemy. Brunhild was genuinely surprised that this strange guy had managed to eliminate an invincible enemy with a single blow, one that she had been unable to defeat, but then nearly died from a common chill. Nevertheless, she thanked her friend again, this time more emotionally, for his feat and for saving her. At that moment, Kurudo suddenly realized that Brunhild looked very similar to the mysterious woman who had been with the Demon King during their last battle. In addition, he remembered that the place where he was now was painfully reminiscent of the very territory that belonged to the Demon King. Not understanding the meaning of these strange statements, Brunhild noted with puzzlement that her interlocutor had previously said some rather strange things about events that, in her opinion, had never happened in history. She then decided to clarify the situation and explained that Niflheim had been torn apart for several hundred years by a brutal struggle between mages and humans with animal abilities who were desperately fighting for complete domination. Even within the strongest clans, an ancient practice is still in use, according to which the strong mercilessly defeat the weak and less protected, leaving them no chance of survival. Brunhild explained that there has been no demon king in the state for a long time, and power actually belongs to the strongest clans. Then, after hesitating, she asked an unexpected question. Given his incredible strength, would the young man like to take such an important position and become the new king? Without a moment's hesitation, Kurudo resolutely refused this dubious offer, stating that he had no need for such power. Suddenly, a loud, mocking voice rang out in the air, announcing with joyful intonations that the long-awaited moment of revelation had finally arrived. Kurudo froze at the realization that he could not hear this voice for no reason. The unknown owner of the voice had previously assumed that the main character had exhausted all his strength and disappeared without a trace. But to his surprise, Kurudo remained a brave and unbroken warrior. Still, the sudden encounter was a pleasant surprise for Kurudo, who immediately remembered his old acquaintance named Graham. The eccentric monster materialized right in front of the young people and announced with pathos that from this very moment, Kurudo's insane, incredible, and truly crazy adventure in the magical world would begin. He also explained meaningfully that the hero who would be called upon in the distant future must be defeated by a certain legendary sword, and that this was inevitable. Laughing at the puzzled faces of his interlocutors, Graham delivered the shocking news. Kurudo would only be able to return to the real world on one condition: if he was eliminated by himself from the future. There was simply no other way. He added that from that moment on, the main character would begin his difficult journey in his new role as the Demon King, which he had just renounced. Interrupting his friend, the main character feverishly tried to explain everything that was happening to himself, but his thoughts were confused and refused to form a coherent picture. Graham patiently, but with a hint of condescension, explained that the defeated ruler in question was none other than the young man himself. The shocking truth was revealed. For some inexplicable reason, Kurudo had found himself in the distant past, and now he faced the incredible task of defeating himself, his future dark alter ego. Stunned by this revelation, Kurudo could not find the strength to fully comprehend and accept this unthinkable problem for a long time. Only after some time of agonizing reflection was he able to summarize what he had heard. He had been summoned to this world with the false goal of defeating the Demon King, but in reality, it was all done in order to bring back to the real world the very same guy who had been thrown back 10 years ago and who, during that time, had become a powerful king of dark magic. Realizing the monstrous seriousness of the situation, Kurudo asked the mysterious traveler with a tremor in his voice whether this case was nothing more than a classic time loop centered on himself. Laughing loudly and heartily, Graham said that every time, in every new iteration, he encountered the same reaction from the young man, as if it were a broken record. Noticing his friend's depressed mood, he philosophically remarked that nothing could change in this world, even despite his own considerable superiority and knowledge. At that moment, the young man could not bear it any longer and began to shout loudly, addressing the heavens with a bitter question. What had he done to deserve such unfair and cruel treatment from fate? Graham calmly noted that the only person who could theoretically save the hero from this fate was a certain Kriemhild. Several years ago, it was this princess who summoned Kurudo to the state with the help of a powerful magical item. But due to an unfortunate mistake in the artifact settings, instead of getting home, Kurudo constantly travels to the past, stuck in a time loop. Trying his best to keep his cool and not panic, Kurudo noted that he still couldn't understand the true purpose of this endless mission and what was wanted of him. Laughing, Graham said that this was a very good and valid question that required a detailed explanation, but immediately added that if he started the story from the beginning, it would take too much precious time to sort out all the complicated circumstances. Suddenly, a rough-looking man in heavy armor appeared from behind the trees and said with surprise that he had not expected to see living people in such a remote and dangerous area. Looking closely at Brunhild, he sarcastically remarked that she was the very girl who had miraculously survived the recent brutal attack on her village. Hearing these tactless words, Brunhild paled and sharply asked the stranger to shut up immediately, because she did not want to remember such a traumatic and painful episode from her life. Smiling insolently, the man remarked that the young lady did not need to be so angry and uncompromising. In addition, he warned meaningfully that his people would stop keeping quiet about what had happened and tell everything they knew if the girl continued to behave so provocatively in the future. At that same unpleasant moment, the insolent man's friend appeared and immediately noticed the valuable artifact in Karudo's hands. Grinning predatorily, the bearded man ordered the girl to be quiet and not say anything unnecessary, threatening her with violence. Stunned by such blatant insolence and rudeness, Brunhild froze for a moment, not knowing how to react. However, Karudo was no longer willing to tolerate such a dismissive and rude attitude towards himself and his companion. Because of this, he swiftly and without warning inflicted significant damage on the enemy, demonstrating that he possessed far more power than could have been imagined. Putting his opponent in an extremely vulnerable and humiliating position, Karudo asked in a harsh tone what exactly this guy had said earlier about Brunhild's burned homeland and how he knew anything about it in the first place. Fearing for his life, the bearded offender stammered that he was not going to discuss this with a stranger. Unwilling to spare his defeated opponent, the protagonist coldly declared that he didn't really care what had happened in that unfortunate settlement. He was now interested in only one thing. Why did this man dare to offend and humiliate an innocent girl who had already suffered so much? At that moment, the protagonist noticed the travelers bustling around, busily searching the ruins and taking anything of value. The leader of this strange company loudly announced to his people that there was nothing left to collect here, and that they could safely return home with their loot. Surprised and puzzled, the young man was eager to find out what was really going on and who all these people were. Then the ugly truth became clear. For some people, tragic events such as the destruction of an entire village are just an excuse for celebration and easy enrichment. People devoid of any moral principles deliberately visit burned and destroyed settlements to take away all the surviving valuable property left without owners with impunity. Looking at what was happening with bitterness and disgust, the blonde warrior explained that this was the cruel law of the magical state in which they found themselves. Moreover, she noted with sadness that everywhere, strong people preyed on the weak and unfortunate with impunity, and this was considered the norm. The leader of the criminal gang accidentally overheard everything the heroes were saying and was taken aback by such audacity. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, he forgot his caution and rushed furiously toward the main character, intending to teach the insolent man a lesson. The gang leader, unwilling to accept the humiliation, swiftly attacked the main character, hoping to prove his superiority in this territory and restore his shaken authority among his people. However, Karudo had no intention of giving up. His intentions were more than serious, and his determination to stand his ground only grew stronger with every passing second. During the fierce battle, the leader began to realize with horror that he was forced to obey Karudo, who demonstrated his clear and undeniable superiority in combat skills with every move. Finding himself in a hopeless situation, the leader was forced to admit that from now on, Karudo was the supreme law and an unquestionable force that could not be resisted. Feeling his own superiority and realizing that the enemy was completely defeated, the main character did not finish off the fallen enemy, but instead asked for help with one thing. It was necessary to properly deal with those who had fallen in battle. Despite their actions, still deserved a proper burial. When the gravestones were laid on the fresh earth, marking the final resting place of the dead, Karudo announced in a firm voice that the criminals could go free, but only on one condition. They must swear never to engage in looting again and never to profit from the misfortune of others. However, a simple promise seemed insufficient to the young man, and he demanded that all the criminals take an unbreakable oath of honesty before each other. Stunned by this demand, the leader with the scar on his face looked his comrades straight in the eye and solemnly uttered the words of the oath, knowing that to break it would mean covering himself with indelible shame. After that, Karudo unexpectedly knelt down right in front of the fresh graves and began to pray quietly, paying tribute to the deceased, whom he himself had sent to the other world. Watching this strange ritual, Brunhild shook her head in surprise and noted to herself that her friend was indeed a very unusual and contradictory person whose actions were difficult to predict. Suddenly, Karudo approached his friend from behind and hugged her tightly, trying to comfort her in her silent grief. Bursting into tears that were difficult to hold back, the boy asked in a trembling voice why the girl was not mourning the loss of her parents and friends at all, since it was so natural. Frightened by such a sudden and frank display of emotion, Brunhild explained incoherently that she saw absolutely no point in crying and showing her weakness to those around her. Turning around, she was astonished to see her friend, this strong warrior, crying bitterly, not hiding his tears. It turned out that Kurudo was experiencing such strong emotions precisely because his friend was not grieving outwardly at all. He understood with all his heart that Brunhild was definitely experiencing the unbearable bitterness of loss, but she could not allow herself to show it, closing herself off. Wanting to calm the emotional hero at least a little, Brunhild dryly informed him that in this cruel state, there is only one law. The strongest survive, and there is no place for weakness. Understanding this, the main character considered it extremely important to clarify a simple truth for her. Tears are a completely normal and natural expression of human emotions, which should not be ashamed of. It was at this delicate and touching moment that Graham silently approached Kurudo from behind and politely apologized for the disturbance, but was forced to interrupt the scene. He demanded that she temporarily forget about returning to the real world and concentrate fully on the current state of affairs, which required immediate intervention. Smiling his mysterious smile, the creature asked what Kurudo thought about everything that was happening and what conclusions he had drawn for himself. Holding his hand on his tousled head, the main character wearily reported that he had a strange premonition, as if his whole life had been preparing him for this moment, for all these trials. And yet he honestly noted that he did not like the moral principle that reigned in this state based on ruthless force. Resolutely rising from his knees, Kurudo declared in a firm voice that he was ready to become the Demon King, since he was destined for such an unusual and difficult fate that he could not escape. During their long journey through the dense forest, the heroes unexpectedly encountered aggressive wild animals. The animals clearly wanted to cause serious harm to the young people and chased them frantically, striving to catch up with and tear apart the strangers at all costs. During the frantic run, fleeing from their pursuers, Brunhild shouted that the law of the strong and the weak had ruled this state for hundreds of years and that it was unlikely that anything would change in the near future. For this reason, the girl believed that it was pointless to even try to change anything in this established cruel system. However, the main character, without slowing down, objected, explaining that in order to simply live, one does not need any significant reason or justification. Life is valuable in itself. In response to these philosophical arguments, Brunhild reasonably stated that beautiful words and good intentions alone would not be enough to avoid the cruel battles and unexpected deadly encounters that lie in wait at every turn. At that very moment, a huge wild wolf tried to attack Brunhild, clearly hoping to feast on fresh prey. However, Brunhild had enough combat experience and excellent reflexes to instantly fight back and successfully resist the sudden enemy. When she noticed her friend's slightly contemptuous gaze, she asked if Kurudo had done something similar in his past, doubting his skills. Receiving a negative answer, the fair-haired warrior sternly explained that in this world, one must always be prepared to fight for one's life, as no one else will do it. Moreover, she mentioned that the young man had previously defeated the Demon King himself, so God himself had commanded him to be able to stand up for himself. In addition, she asked him not to overestimate his own strength, as she believed that this cruel state could not be saved by one strong hero alone. More serious changes were needed. Having received understanding and approval from his friend, Brunhild was about to admit that he was undoubtedly a very skilled warrior. But before she could finish, she was rudely interrupted by the young man. With his eyes burning with an unusual fire, Kurudo suddenly expressed a strange desire to feed the wild beast that had just been chasing them. In addition, he optimistically announced that his friend could be a little less strict and combative, because any wolf could be easily defeated with his magical power if something went wrong. However, it turned out that the bait for the hungry beast was to be the meat that Brunhild had prudently obtained during the previous successful battle and was carrying with her. In addition, this valuable supply of provisions was intended for the young people themselves, who would inevitably get hungry during the long hike. And yet, without thinking twice, the main character threw all the food to the ravenous wolves and waited with interest for their reaction. Brunhild, angry to the point of fury, began to loudly scold her friend, calling him a very stupid person who was engaged in completely meaningless and even harmful work. Continuing to shout indignantly, she explained that such a temporary solution to the problem would in no way change the cruel system of relationships in this world. At that moment, Brunhild noticed a strange sight. The well-fed wolves, having eaten their fill, lay down peacefully on the ground, having lost all interest in the fugitives. Then Kurudo calmly explained his logic. Earlier, they had disturbed other animals and thus unwittingly provoked predators, disturbing their peace. He sincerely believed that they should first apologize for the intrusion and only then engage in honest and open dialogue with the inhabitants of the forest. When the young man cautiously approached one of the wolves, it instantly jumped to its feet and bared its huge teeth threateningly, ready to attack. Stretching out his open hand in front of the animal, the main character tried with all his might to keep his composure and not lose his life. Suddenly, as if on cue, all the wolves scattered in fear in different directions, and the heroes saw a small, trembling girl who had run out from behind the trees. The young girl, gasping for breath from fear and running, began to desperately ask for help from the unfamiliar adults. She told them about her brother, who had suffered very serious, possibly fatal injuries. At that moment, a huge snow monster appeared from the depths of the forest, possessing an incredibly large body and seemingly endless reserves of brute strength. Attacking the large and dangerous enemy, the main character tried with all his might to activate his own magical power, which had been dormant within him. When his dragon heart began to work at full power, his strength instantly increased many times over. So did the devastating damage inflicted on his opponent. At the moment when the enemy was finally defeated and collapsed to the ground, the hero looked at the unconscious stranger who urgently needed medical attention. However, Karuto remembered with horror that he had used up all his health potions very recently when treating a wounded animal in the forest. Hearing this, Brunhild cried out in surprise and began to shout indignantly, saying that her friend had acted extremely foolishly and irresponsibly. The girl was absolutely convinced that such a valuable potion, capable of even resurrecting people from the world of the dead, should not be wasted on animals. However, the main character asked his friend to calm down, as he himself had no idea that this medicine belonged to the category of the rarest and truly legendary artifacts. Looking contemptuously at the naive young man, Brunhild thought gloomily that he was too kind and completely reckless for this cruel world. And yet Karuto belatedly realized that this potion would be easy and simple to obtain 10 years in the future in the state he had already visited. But now, when technological and magical progress had not yet gone so far, this medicine was an extremely rare and priceless resource that was not to be squandered. The little girl, having calmed down a little and wiped away her tears, asked hopefully if they had such a potion, would there be a chance to save her dying brother. Approaching the little girl and sitting down next to her, the main character gently explained that her relative had hit his head quite hard during the fall. For this reason, it was important not to take any sudden actions with him, but to proceed with caution. However, the girl rummaged through the pocket of her old dress and unexpectedly pulled out a small bottle with a shimmering magical substance and silently handed it to Karuto. Smiling with joy and surprise, Karuto exclaimed that this was the very legendary medicine they had just been talking about. Confirming the purpose of the bottle, the girl asked the hero in a trembling voice to give the medicine to her brother as soon as possible to save him. Karuto unquestioningly followed the instruction, carefully pouring a few drops into the victim's mouth. Within seconds, the young man named Otar came to his senses with surprise, slowly got up from the ground, and looked around in amazement, unable to believe that he had survived such a terrible battle. Sometime later, the main character proudly presented his companions with a dish he had prepared, which took pride of place in the center of the improvised table. The guys looked with genuine surprise and curiosity at the appetizing baked meat, exuding a wonderful aroma, which was prepared by Karuto according to his own unique recipe, known only to him. Wishing everyone a pleasant meal, Karuto smiled and said that everyone should eat their fill and be satisfied. During lunch, the guys eagerly praised the unusual dish, sincerely noting that they had never tasted anything like it before in their lives, not even anything close to it in taste. Brunhild was pleasantly surprised that some people could eat such delicious, exquisite, and varied food on a regular basis, rather than being content with coarse fare. Then Karuto, a little embarrassed by such a flood of praise, asked his friend not to exaggerate his modest culinary abilities, as he considered himself only an amateur. He explained knowledgeably that ideally, this dish should be made with high-quality beef, which has a more suitable and rich flavor, but they had to make do with what they had. Turning to a little girl named Salida, the main character gently asked her to tell him something important about the place they came from. He also prudently warned her that she could feel free to talk while eating, as this was not against the rules of etiquette. And yet, the main character was most interested in how big the space was beyond that very unknown hole they had discovered. After chewing another piece of juicy meat, the girl candidly admitted that she had not gone too far or descended deep enough into the gloomy underground to be able to judge anything specific or draw any conclusions. Then Karuto made a bold assumption that behind the mysterious hole, there could well be ancient ruins left over from a long-lost civilization. Brunhild skeptically remarked that this information did not make much sense, since everyone had long been well aware of the exact location of all the more or less significant ruins in the area. Begging them not to rush to conclusions, the main character turned to Otar with a question, hoping to hear a different opinion. The guy, chewing his food carefully, thoughtfully said that it was all because of the existing system, which did not allow for development. Karuto resolutely announced that he intended to radically change the entire state system. In addition, he expressed the bold idea that Niflheim in its current form cannot be considered a state in the usual and generally accepted sense of the word. Karuto explained in detail that previously in Yggdrasia, where he had once been summoned, trade was well established, the political system worked, and there were developed commodity-money relations between people. Meanwhile, in the current Niflheim, most people were not even aware of the existence of money as such, living in the old-fashioned way. Enjoying her lunch, Brunhild skeptically noted that all these clever innovations were unlikely to take root in her harsh homeland, where brute force and instincts ruled. Karuto then heatedly objected that if the state did not exist in essence, then they had no choice but to create it themselves from scratch, according to their own rules. Everyone in the room was literally struck to the core by what they heard. No one could believe that the ambitious Karuto would seriously undertake the organization of an entirely new state, taking on this unimaginable burden. Stunned by such boldness, Brunhild asked if her friend fully understood what he was saying and what exactly he wanted to do in the foreseeable future. Then the main character calmly and thoroughly explained that there were many things to take care of: money, the economy, legislation, infrastructure, and other necessary attributes. However, this did not scare him at all, and it did not stop him in any way from achieving the grand goal he had set for himself. Clutching his familiar chopsticks, the main character suddenly announced solemnly that the very thing that could solve all the organizational issues at once and start the process of creating a state was located in the ancient ruins where they were going. Watching what was happening and listening to these strange words, the young people began to wonder if their friend had accidentally gone mad from overwork. Activating the dragon's power that lay dormant within him, Karuto intoned a powerful magic spell in an unfamiliar language. The ground beneath their feet shook noticeably, and Brunhild instantly went on full alert, not knowing what to expect. The entire room was suddenly illuminated by a bright, blinding light. Karuto summoned flames born from the scorching sea that rippled deep within the earth. He also loudly asked the element of fire to enter his body, granting him unprecedented power. At that moment, an unbearable heat cut through the air, and the roaring sound of raging flames could be heard. A fiery hurricane began to rise rapidly from the ground, at the foot of which a clearly delineated magical star appeared. In shock from what she had seen, Brunhild was amazed to realize that she had never suspected her friend of possessing such amazing and powerful magical abilities. When everything was ready for the transfer, the main character announced that he was immediately heading to the ancient ruins. He also made a serious request to Otar: close the entrance to the dungeon if he is unable to return before dawn. It turned out that on the other side, there were not only good and useful things, but also extremely dangerous creatures and mechanisms. If the main character fails to return home within the specified time, then there is no point in waiting for him at all, as he will be considered dead. Taking a small, inconspicuous object resembling a button out of his pocket, Karuto explained that it was a special explosive charge designed for mining work, which he had once received as a gift from an acquaintance in gratitude for his help. Moreover, he explained in detail that in a critical situation, it would be necessary to simply press this button and immediately move as far away as possible to avoid being caught in the powerful blast wave. The main character also prudently informed his friends that, just in case, he would leave them a sufficient supply of food and all the necessary items to help them survive in his absence. Unable to bear these grim preparations any longer, Otar shouted loudly, demanding that the conversation be stopped. In addition, he excitedly asked them not to prepare for the worst outcome in advance, because Karuto simply had to return from this dangerous journey alive and unharmed. He justified his sincere request in a rather unexpected way. He had no idea how to cook such delicious meals himself and did not want to starve to death. Smiling at this naive but touching concern, Karuto promised that in that case, he would do everything possible and impossible to return home unharmed. Trying to justify his weakness a little, Otar sheepishly clarified that he just didn't want to upset his younger sister Salida, who was very attached to him. Laughing at the situation, The main character insisted on his decision and said that he would leave the necessary button with Otar in case of unforeseen circumstances. Clutching the small but important object in his hands, Otar solemnly promised that he would follow all instructions and wait patiently for dawn, hoping for the best. As soon as Kuruto and Brunhild stood in the center of the magic circle, everything around them was instantly plunged into pitch darkness. Suddenly, Brunhild cried out in fear, cursing those who dared to turn off the light at such a crucial moment. Noticing his friend's violent reaction, Kuruto asked with a sly smile if she was afraid of the dark like a little child. Receiving a proud negative answer, he only smiled wider, watching the frightened expression on his friend's face, which clearly contradicted her words. Suddenly, Graham materialized out of the thick darkness, appearing specifically to scare Brunhild. He enjoyed her reaction. Demanding immediate answers to his accumulated questions, the main character tried to grab the nimble magical creature, but it turned out to be much more agile and faster. In addition, Graham philosophically explained that, despite all his unusual abilities and knowledge, he did not have the ability to know absolutely all the answers to the countless questions that tormented him. Quickly touching the young man, the mysterious mentor opened a passage to the other world for a moment and instantly disappeared, as if he had never been there. Suddenly, a bright light appeared around them again, and before the astonished heroes appeared a grandiose and majestic structure, the scale of which was beyond imagination. It was a gloomy catacomb with a sharp descent leading deep underground. All the walls around them were skillfully framed with bizarre ancient patterns and mysterious drawings, the meaning of which had long been lost. It turned out that the young people were now standing on one of dozens of platforms, descending in tiers. He bowed his head, and trying to see the bottom, the main character was shocked to note that for the first time in his life, he was observing an underground space of such incredible scale. Noticing the obvious confusion and bewilderment on her friend's face, Brunhild asked with concern if he was all right. She was genuinely worried about his condition. Then Kuruto gathered his thoughts and firmly stated that he wholeheartedly aspired to a good and dignified life in the future, and that it was worth the risk. Trying to appear more courageous and decisive than he actually felt, he reminded her that he was still officially a hero. It was for this reason that Kuruto volunteered to explore the dangerous ruins alone, so as not to put any of his companions in mortal danger. Left alone, as he thought, Kuruto pondered heavily that, despite all the beautiful and courageous words Brunhild had said to reassure her, he actually had no idea what to do next or how to proceed. However, Brunhild was still standing behind him, having consciously chosen to stay with her comrade in danger rather than climb to safety. Surprised and touched by this unexpected act, Kuruto tried to warn her that such dungeons usually hide a huge number of deadly traps, cunning mechanisms, and other dangers. At that moment, a loud mechanical notification sounded from all around, warning of imminent serious danger to all intruders. Hearing this, Kuruto noted with bitterness that such unpleasant notifications of danger would now appear quite often, if not constantly. Suddenly, the dungeon system loudly and clearly notified everyone present of the detection of an intruder in the protected area, classifying it as a threat. Turning sharply at the sound, the heroes were horrified to see little Salida standing dangerously close to some unknown and clearly suspicious object. Reacting quickly, Brunhild neutralized the strange object near the children with one deft and precise movement, preventing an imminent explosion. When the immediate threat had passed, Brunhild, unable to contain her emotions, began to loudly scold the girl for exposing herself and everyone around her to enormous and unjustified danger by going down into the dungeon without permission. Not expecting such a rapid and dangerous turn of events, the main character stood frozen in shock and feverishly thought about his next course of action in the changed circumstances. However, his intense thoughts were rudely interrupted by the dungeon's voice system, which announced that all security systems, without exception, had been put on high alert. It turned out that due to the unauthorized launch of the Protection and Intruder Detection Protocol, the dungeon had been granted full authority to eliminate any offender it deemed necessary to preserve its integrity. At that very moment, dozens of formidable combat robots materialized on the platform where the heroes were standing. In unison, with chilling mechanical voices, they declared the need to carry out the order to destroy all strangers. Looking at this armada of death, Kuruto realized with chilling horror that all his carefully thought-out plans had been completely and irrevocably destroyed. Moreover, he clearly understood that there was no way they could defeat an entire squad of professional combat robots on their own. The only possible solution for the heroes in this critical situation was to evacuate the hostile dungeon immediately and at any cost. when Kuruto desperately activated her magical ability. Part of the platform beneath the girl's feet gave way and collapsed rapidly. Brunhild and Salida flew into the abyss along with the debris, not having time to jump out of the way. Screaming desperately, Kuruto stretched out his arms, trying with all his might to catch and hold his falling friends, but it was too late. At the same time, the mysterious guardian of the dungeon watched everything happening from the shadows. He laughed heartily. He was genuinely delighted that, for the first time in many long years, such interesting and lively visitors had come to see him. In the distant past, even before all the incredible events, a girl with two neat pigtails, who was an experienced mentor, began a thorough analysis of the mistakes made during the previous expedition to the dangerous ruins. Almost all of the shortcomings and miscalculations were in one way or another connected with the main character, who at that time did not yet possess the powerful strength and combat experience that he had now. First of all, the warrior explained in a stern tone that she should not have suffered a serious injury to her arm under any circumstances, and that it was all due to the stupidity and carelessness of her subordinates. Hearing this accusation, which he considered unfair, Kuruto muttered very quietly, under his breath, but still loud enough to be heard, that the leader herself was very clumsy and awkward, which was why she had been injured. These careless words greatly angered the girl, who instantly changed her tone to an icy one and demanded that Kuruto immediately name the 5 basic and most important rules of exploring ruins, which he had drilled into them in every class. Stunned by this turn of events, the main character paused for a moment, feverishly searching his memory for the instructions, and finally confidently announced that he was ready to answer this tricky question. The first and fundamental rule of the dungeon was to pay close attention not only to objects lying on the ground, but also to the entire surrounding space. Agreeing wholeheartedly, the mentor explained in detail that one should carefully examine the smallest joints between the slabs, the slightest differences in height, and the barely noticeable differences in the color and texture of the surfaces. In addition, she emphatically stated that one must look at literally everything around them without missing a single detail because the life of the entire group directly depends on it. It turned out that it was precisely because of an unfortunate mistake made by one of the inexperienced adventurers that the girl had been injured last time, stepping where she shouldn't have. The second rule was voiced by a bearded man named Stein, who was sitting nearby and spoke without being invited. This rule stated that under no circumstances should one rush when exploring ruins, because everyone knows that those who rush and fuss are the first to die, falling into traps. Reiterating what another experienced person had said, the warrior noted that neither treasures nor monsters would go anywhere while the group moved cautiously and steadily. When an adventurer begins to rush unnecessarily, they unconsciously and inevitably make a large number of serious, sometimes fatal mistakes and gross violations of established safety rules. Bursting out in a cry of pent-up irritation, the mentor asked how many more times she would have to repeat these seemingly obvious things before her foolish fighters finally understood them once and for all. The third most important rule was to always and everywhere use silence as your most sensitive and reliable ally. Any strange sounds, such as a sudden ringing, a suspicious click, or a threatening hiss, could tell an attentive listener a great deal about the surrounding environment and impending danger. The fourth unbreakable rule was that under no circumstances should one be greedy, because the best and most valuable things are usually found at the very end of the journey. It turns out that many cunning creators of deadly traps initially count on the unbridled greed of inexperienced adventurers who are chasing quick profits. It is for this important reason that some fighters should show prudence and retreat in time to avoid irreparable mistakes. The fifth rule was the most important, fundamental, and, one might say, the cornerstone of the entire philosophy of survival in the ruins. The real victory for any self-respecting warrior is a safe return home, alive and unharmed. Then the mentor firmly and categorically stated that no treasure, even the most fabulous, is worth a human life and health. She argued her unshakable opinion very simply and clearly. It will always be possible to return to this same dungeon again, later, when there is more experience and strength, but no one is given a second life. Lighting a cigarette out of exhaustion and nervous tension, the girl asked her students one last time, now more calmly, to remain vigilant and cautious, as their shared future depended on it. The main character suddenly remembered that he had not seen the mysterious Mr. Flavendus for quite some time and decided to inquire about his unexpected disappearance and current whereabouts. The mentor's face darkened, and she explained briefly and dryly that this acquaintance could no longer be considered an ally, because he had chosen a different path. And yet, he tried with all his might to find Brunhild and little Salida in this chaos of destruction. Kurudo mentally cursed himself for so foolishly forgetting the 5 sacred rules of descending into ruins at the most crucial moment, when they were most needed. Frowning and concentrating, he began to look closely at the unstable situation around him, searching for any clue. Suddenly, Kurudo's gaze fell on a strange detail, and he noted to himself that there were traces of recent collapses and destruction everywhere on the platform. But at the same time, there were absolutely no traces of the most destructive impact, as if the stones had fallen on their own, for no apparent reason. Brunhild looked anxiously at her young friend, who was desperately frightened by the sudden fall. After quickly and carefully checking that the girl was unharmed, Brunhild noted with relief, but also with concern, that their dangerous adventure was becoming more and more risky with every passing minute. Suddenly, she noticed her friend, who was desperately waving his arms, trying to attract attention. Finally noticing his friends alive and unharmed, Kurudo breathed a huge sigh of relief, thanking fate that his loved ones were safe and unharmed in the fall. However, he immediately warned loudly that the risk of another collapse was still very high and that they needed to be extremely careful in their actions and movements. Salida, in turn, seeing Kurudo in front of her, cried out loudly and joyfully, trying with all her might to call him, waving her little hands. Nevertheless, Brunhild turned to the girl and sternly explained that she had saved her only for her own sake, and not out of any altruistic motives, wishing to emphasize that everyone must be able to take responsibility for themselves. When Kurudo, tormented by curiosity, wanted to know why the girls above were talking in such a serious tone, he shouted loudly, trying to drown out the noise, and because of the sharp sound, the already unstable platform collapsed another level lower, dragging the debris with it. Looking at her friend, Brunhild asked about his next plan of action because they had fallen too deep and it would be impossible to get out just like that. Stunned by the scale of the new disaster, the main character was forced to admit that this time things were much worse and more serious than just a few minutes ago, when they had only begun their descent. Sighing heavily, Brunhild pragmatically announced that in such a hopeless situation, they now needed to find another way out and explore the unfamiliar surroundings with extreme caution, hoping for the best. Meanwhile, on the surface, at the entrance to the dungeon, Otar was frantically trying to find his suddenly disappeared sister, but he couldn't even find her bag, which she had left at the entrance. Deeply worried about his only close relative and unable to wait any longer for the unknown, he made the difficult but only possible decision to immediately descend into the dangerous dungeon to bring Salida back at any cost. When, after many difficulties, the heroes finally managed to reunite in one of the lower halls, they saw before them an amazing and majestic structure surrounded by a bright, almost blinding glow emanating from it. It turned out that this incredible structure was the legendary Sun Horn, about which there were so many myths and legends. Brunhild, holding her breath, wanted to know her friend's opinion about this extraordinary and unexpected find. Earlier in her life, she had never seen this mythical artifact with her own eyes, only in old pictures, and therefore honestly admitted that everything that was happening now seemed to her to be something out of an incredible fairy tale. In addition, Brunhild considered it extremely important to explain her doubts. No one in their right mind, and with a sound memory, would display such a valuable and powerful item in such an open and accessible space without any serious security. Ly agreeing with his friend's reasonable opinion, Kurudo noted that in this case, it looked very much like a stupid and malicious joke on the part of unknown ill-wishers luring gullible treasure hunters into a trap. Allowing himself to entertain the idea of taking such a valuable artifact with him, he suddenly pulled himself together, remembering the 4th golden rule of descending into the dungeon. That greed does not lead to good. Rejecting his doubts, Brunhild assured him that the object itself looked exactly as it was described in ancient legends, down to the smallest detail. In addition, she seriously warned that it was not worth getting too close to this dangerous object, as it was unknown how it would react. It turns out that, according to numerous rumors and legends, it was this mysterious horn that once caused the destruction of an entire ancient and powerful civilization, destroying everything around it. However, along with this dark prophecy, there was another, brighter legend that this artifact was capable of giving the whole world eternal springtime and unprecedented prosperity to the people who used it correctly. Breaking into an excited cry, Brunhild explained that despite the beauty of this fantasy, the risk posed by the unknown object was now too great to risk lives. Unexpectedly for everyone, the horn began to move slowly and frighteningly across the platform for no apparent reason, as if it were alive. At that moment, the main character hastily summoned Graham, trying to find out if his mysterious companion was to blame for what had happened, if he had accidentally activated the artifact. The concerned magical creature sincerely replied that it had done nothing and had not even planned to approach this thing, and that it was seeing it for the first time. Salita, mesmerized, could not stop staring at Graham, secretly believing that it was a wonderful, kind fairy who would surely help them. Not receiving a clear answer to the most pressing question, Kurudo feverishly pondered what actions to take in this critical situation. During their tense stay in the depths of the dungeon, the heroes completely failed to notice how the mysterious guardian of the ruins, who appeared out of nowhere, suddenly and silently attacked them. The unknown stranger clearly intended to deal a crushing blow to Kurudo, but at the last moment, Brunhild desperately protected him with her body, taking the blow herself. The girl lightning fast used her signature combat move, and everyone in the room was genuinely surprised by such incredible strength and self-sacrifice coming from a fragile girl. However, this heroic action did not stop the mysterious guardian of the ruins, who easily dodged and approached little Salita. He unexpectedly thanked her for coming to him, as if they had known each other for a long time. Unable to physically help the girl immediately, Kurudo cried out loudly and desperately in helplessness, calling on all his powers for help. However, Brunhild was not at all satisfied that the dangerous enemy had not received the damage he deserved from her attack, and then she resolutely repeated her strike, wanting at all costs to punish the wayward and invulnerable stranger for his insolence. Suddenly, the entire huge platform beneath their feet shook violently. Brunhild lost her balance and fell heavily onto the cold stone floor. Watching this terrible turn of events, the main character once again mentally cursed himself for his mistake and inability to protect his friends. Bursting into loud, almost unnatural laughter, the mysterious opponent noted with satisfaction that he had not had so much fun and excitement in the last few hundred years of imprisonment. Reaching out his pale hands to the bewildered young man, the guardian of the ruins unexpectedly announced in a friendly tone that he was ready to play a little with the uninvited guests. In addition, she eagerly declared that she wanted to choose the most interesting and fair game for everyone present, and therefore the main character must immediately say what he most liked to play in his free time. Rising from the cold stone floor and dusting off her clothes, Brunhild stated firmly that they had no desire to play any games with a stranger. She also made it as clear as possible that they were interested only in serious negotiations and nothing more. Defending his friend and supporting her words, the main character also said that he had no intention of fighting and would prefer to resolve everything peacefully. And yet, their mysterious opponent unexpectedly agreed to negotiations, noting that he loved to talk at length about various interesting things with intelligent people. Before the heroes had time to recover, comfortable chairs on wheels materialized right under them from the ground. They instantly and silently moved them closer to the guardian, as if they were puppets. Looking closely at the enemy's face, the main character was surprised to see that it was not a terrible monster at all, but a very young girl with a frantic, darting gaze that revealed something unhealthy. Gathering everyone around one large table, the stranger fluttered over it and asked what exactly their further conversation would be about and what topics they would like to discuss. Laughing again at some thought of her own, she noted that she herself would begin the dialogue by politely introducing herself to her unexpected guests. Being tightly tied to a chair, Brunhild, despite her dire situation, felt it was important to speak up loudly that this was not a funny joke at all and did not resemble friendly negotiations. Paying no attention to the restless and perpetually dissatisfied warrior, the guardian of the ruins turned her keen gaze to little Salita. She was extremely interested in the fact that the girl was wounded, and despite this, for some reason, she did not use the healing potion that she surely had. A few moments later, the stranger, continuing to laugh heartily, stole a single hair from Salita's head with a lightning-fast movement and examined it closely. Completely unable to understand what was happening and why this strange ritual was necessary, the main character was deeply perplexed and confused. Noticing the general confusion and bewilderment, the cunning woman declared with a satisfied look that Kurudo, apparently, simply had no idea about the true nature and composition of the legendary healing potion. Kurudo then cautiously suggested that he had already used such a medicine himself once, and it seemed to him that the sorceress had used her own plasma or something similar to create it. Sincerely delighted with the correct and almost accurate answer, his interlocutor happily hinted that the young man was absolutely right in his guesses. The shocking truth was revealed. To use the legendary potion capable of resurrecting people even from the world of the dead, special cells from the girl herself, who was the source of it, were used. After a short but tense silence, she finally introduced herself and called herself Ivizal. The girl is the guardian of life and holiness, in essence, an ideal and perfect being called upon to maintain the fragile balance in this world. Laughing again, she candidly admitted that, in other words, she could call herself the ruler of the 8th solar mountain they see before them. Karuto, Brunhild, and little Solita were extremely surprised by this unexpected confession, unable to immediately find the right words to respond. Then Ivazel asked them to call her Izuna from now on, as she liked that name better. At that very moment, the main character suddenly remembered that Izuna was one of the 4 legendary generals of the Demon King's army, about whom there were so many rumors. It turned out that this girl was known throughout the state under the honorary title of Golden Stream of Prosperity for her amazing abilities. And yet Karuto clearly remembered this lady as a mature and respectable woman who was sometimes extremely harsh and merciless to her enemies. Moreover, he could not believe that this young lady in front of him and that harsh woman were one and the same person, and that she could change so radically in just 10 years. Suddenly, Izuna turned to Solita. She asked her to speak up if she had any questions. The girl timidly asked if the lady had known her personally before that day. Laughing, Izuna admitted that it was indeed a very good and valid question. In addition, she shared some surprising information. Exactly 2 months and 3 days ago, the girl had accidentally fallen into these ruins through a small crack in the wall while exploring the surroundings. Laughing at the pleasant memories, the Guardian explained that she simply had to welcome such a rare guest, especially since Solita was the first living person to enter these ruins in the last several hundred years. Hugging the stunned Solita tightly and tenderly, Izuna said admiringly that she had been eagerly awaiting a new meeting and had been wondering all this time whether the lovely girl would come to visit her again or forget the way. Suddenly, this warm and touching conversation was rudely interrupted by Brunhild, who was extremely dissatisfied with the current state of affairs and her own powerless condition. In addition, she loudly and indignantly declared that she considered it extremely unfair that she was the only one among all those present to be sitting in heavy shackles, as if she were a dangerous criminal. Brunhild sarcastically remarked that Izuna seemed extremely suspicious and untrustworthy. She was also incredibly annoyed by her interlocutor's pompous and excessively long title, who, on top of everything else, claimed to have lived in this dark dungeon for hundreds of years in complete solitude. Despite all her indignation, Brunhild wanted to know clearly and unequivocally who this new mysterious acquaintance was. Namely, was she an enemy to be fought, or a potential ally to be dealt with? Laughing at yet another tirade, Izuna reasonably pointed out that they had only just met, and she was not yet ready to give a definite answer to such a complex question about their future relationship. After thinking for a moment and weighing everything, she cautiously noted that she was neither an enemy nor a comrade to them, but somewhere in between. Still, Izuna sincerely said that she just wanted to have a pleasant and interesting time with her new, but already dear friends. At that very moment, the main character feverishly realized that if she was indeed the 4th General Izuna, then it was absolutely necessary to get her as an ally at all costs in order to carry out his grand plans. Moreover, he clearly understood that this girl possessed the golden mountain he needed, without which nothing would work out. He wanted to speak up immediately and offer his terms. Karuto heard the loud whisper of his fair-haired friend, who advised him to simply take the valuable artifact by force during the fleeting battle, without ceremony. And yet, the main character did not want to quarrel with anyone, let alone fight, so he firmly and openly declared that he wanted to use the solar horn to radically change this cruel state for the better. He also expressed his secret desire to do what no one had dared to do for the last 100 years, namely, to become the new Demon King and finally bring order. Such an unexpected and bold response was extremely surprising to everyone present, including Izuna herself. However, once she recovered from her surprise, the Guardian bitterly stated that Karuto was apparently completely unaware of the terrible catastrophe associated with the Sun Mountain. The terrible truth came to light. Once upon a time, because of this powerful artifact, an entire prosperous civilization disappeared without a trace in a single night, leaving only ruins behind. The Guardian of the dungeon wanted to know, for sure, whether her interlocutor was really aware of all the risks. And yet, did he still want to use such a dangerous and unpredictable power again? Then, with disappointment and resentment in her voice, she stated that she was very disappointed that she had waited hundreds of years for someone extraordinary, but instead had found someone completely ordinary who did not understand the full responsibility. Large tears suddenly appeared in Izuna's eyes, and with a trembling but firm voice, she announced her intention to eliminate anyone who dared to try to get the solar horn into their selfish hands without understanding its true nature. At that moment, the main character's hands were bound by heavy magical chains that deprived him of mobility. Kurudo shouted loudly and desperately, trying to explain that what had happened was a terrible misunderstanding and that he had no intention of offending her or stealing anything. However, the angry mistress was not going to stop there and listen to excuses. She quickly activated her ancient weapon, and a huge golem in heavy iron armor, glistening in the dim light, began to slowly rise from under the table. Realizing that he was now facing a truly powerful and dangerous opponent, Kurudo realized with horror that things were looking very bad and a peaceful outcome was unlikely. Feverishly looking around for a way out, he loudly asked everyone to calm down and try to talk about everything in a calm atmosphere, without unnecessary violence. Suddenly, Kurudo felt a familiar heat in his chest due to the approaching mortal danger, and his dragon heart automatically activated, filling his body with unprecedented strength. Paying close attention to the young man's sudden burst of strength, Izuna exclaimed in amazement that she would never allow this dangerous man to even touch the golden cauldron, since he possessed such power. Hearing this categorical statement, Kurudo realized that he had no choice but to accept the unequal battle and fight for his life and the lives of his friends. He quickly reached for his trusty sword. The main character noticed Graham out of the corner of his eye, gesturing desperately and warning him not to even begin this hopeless battle with the Guardian in her own lair. Unwilling to listen to his cautious mentor at such a critical moment, the main character explained that ordinary attacks would most likely be completely useless against this giant golem. In addition, he was confident that if he inflicted heavy damage with some kind of massive object, it would be an effective attack capable of piercing the armor. However, the short-lived battle was not successful. The protagonist suffered serious bruises and injuries during the unequal battle with the monster. With difficulty, Kurudo got up from the cold ground after the crushing blow and was surprised to see a completely unfamiliar, strange room with a large number of impenetrable, airtight capsules lined up in a row. Completely unaware of his location and how he got there, Kurudo looked around in confusion, trying to get his bearings. Suddenly, the soulless system loudly announced the preparation of a special protective suit for safe work with the Solar Mountain. After a thorough check of access rights, an identification of the launch took place, and the main character saw before him a massive, impressive protective suit made of high-strength metal, glistening in the dim light of the underground. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.